All right, welcome to the deep dive. So today we're really going deep, deep down into the world of hydraulic fracturing design.
Sounds exciting.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at chapter 17 of the book Hydraulic Fracturing.
Yeah, I know that one.
Yeah, and it's a big one, it's a dense one, lots of technical details in there, but we're going to try to break it down for you.
That's what we're here for.
So, if you're involved in the oil and gas industry, you're prepping for a meeting, or you're just a curious mind who wants to learn more about this fascinating process, you've come to the right place.
Well, it's pretty amazing, isn't it?
It is. It is. I mean, we're talking about manipulating forces thousands of feet below the surface of the Earth.
Like a bit of a recipe, you know? You need to get the right mix of ingredients to make it all work.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're going to be focusing on today, the data you need to design and analyze these treatments.
Exactly. The book actually lays out an 8-step process for designing a hydraulic fracturing treatment.
8 steps. Okay, we're going to need a roadmap for this one.
Don't worry, we'll guide you through it. But the key takeaway here is that every step requires data.
So, like, each step relies on the one before it, kind of like a chain reaction.
Exactly. And if one link in that chain is weak, the whole treatment could be compromised.
Okay, so no pressure then. Every data point is crucial.
Pretty much. So let's start at the beginning. Before we even think about injecting fluid, we need to understand the reservoir we're dealing with.
Okay, makes sense. We need to know what we're working with down there. So what kind of data are we talking about when we're looking at the reservoir?
Well, permeability is a big one.
Permeability.
Yeah, it's essentially a measure of how easily fluids can flow through the rock.
Oh, okay. So like if the rock is really porous, permeability would be high.
Exactly. And this directly impacts the length and effectiveness of those fractures we create.
So low permeability means it's harder to create those long fractures we need.
You got it. The book uses this term called dimensionless conductivity, or FCD.
FCD. Okay, got it.
It's basically a way to measure how well the fractures are doing their job. Ideally, you want an FCD of 2 or greater.
So that means the fractures are wide open, like a super highway for the oil and gas to flow through.
That's a great analogy. We want those hydrocarbons to flow freely.
Makes sense. What else do we need to know about the reservoir?
Well, reservoir pressure and temperature are critical.
Why is that?
They help us figure out the existing stress on the rock and choose the right fluids for the job.
Ah, so it's kind of like baking a cake at high altitude, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You wouldn't use the same recipe, would you? The environment dictates your approach.
Totally. So how do pressure and temperature actually affect our fluid selection?
Well, imagine you're dealing with a high-pressure, high-temperature reservoir.
Okay, yeah.
You need a fluid that can handle those extreme conditions, something that won't break down under pressure.
Right. It's got to be tough, almost like a special heat-resistant material for a spacecraft, right? It has to be built for that environment. What about the fluids that are already in the reservoir? Does that matter?
Absolutely. We need to know what type of fluid it is, how it flows, what it's made of, and how much water is present. If there are any nearby water zones, we want to avoid those like the plague.
Why is that?
Well, we definitely don't want to contaminate those zones or create any unintended pathways for fluids to migrate.
Oh, right. That makes sense. So we need to know everything about what's down there before we start injecting anything new. Okay, so what else do we look at when we're assessing the reservoir?
Well, we also need to consider things like the drainage area, which is the zone influenced by the well.
Okay, drainage area.
Then there's porosity, the amount of empty space in the rock.
Porosity, right.
And net pay thickness, which is the thickness of that hydrocarbon-bearing layer we're targeting.
So it's all about understanding the potential of the reservoir, like how much oil and gas is actually down there and how easy it will be to get it out. Anything else we need to be aware of at this stage?
One more thing. Some formations can be sensitive to the fluids we use for fracturing. If we're not careful, we could actually reduce the permeability, clogging up those pathways we talked about earlier.
Oh no, that's not what we want. How do you figure out if a formation is going to be sensitive or not?
Well, lab tests are really the most definitive way.
Okay, lab tests.
But there are some clues we can look for, like very low water saturation in dry gas zones. It could be a bit of a red flag.
So we need to be on the lookout for those warning signs.
Exactly. It's a bit like detective work, you know? We're constantly looking for clues to help us understand the reservoir.
Right, so we've got this whole reservoir investigation going on.
Yeah, it's all about gathering as much information as possible before we make any decisions.
Okay, we've done our due diligence on the reservoir. We've got a good understanding of what we're dealing with down there. What's the next step in our data journey?
Log data is up next.
Log data. Okay, fill me in. What's that all about?
Well, it's like getting a sneak peek inside the formation. These logs give us all sorts of information about the rock layers, the fluids, and the pressures down there.
So it's like a medical scan for the Earth.
Yeah. We can see things like the path of the well bore, the types of rock we're drilling through, the porosity, and even the acoustic properties of the formation.
Wow, that's incredible. So we're really building a detailed picture of what's going on down there. And what about geological data? How does that fit into the equation?
Geological data is crucial. It can really make or break the whole operation.
I bet. So what are we looking for in terms of geological data?
Things like the presence of natural fractures or faults, for
Oh
example.
yeah, natural fractures. I've always been fascinated by those, how they're already there in the rock and how they interact with the fractures we're trying to create.
Yeah, it's almost like we're piggybacking on nature's own system.
Mm.
And understanding those natural fractures is especially critical in shale reservoirs.
Why is that?
Well, shale is naturally less permeable, so those natural fractures can really enhance the flow of hydrocarbons.
Okay, so we need to know where those fractures are, what direction they're running in, and how they might affect our treatment.
Exactly. We also need to consider the stress orientation, which tells us which way those hydraulic fractures are going to grow.
Stress orientation.
Yeah, it's basically the direction of the forces that are pushing on the rock.
Oh, okay. So if we know the stress orientation, we can kind of predict where those fractures will go.
Exactly. This helps us place the wells correctly, space them out strategically, and maximize the drainage area.
So it's about working with the natural forces, not against them, kind of like a martial arts expert using their opponent's energy to their advantage. We're really starting to build quite a comprehensive picture here.
It's all about piecing together the puzzle, right?
What's next on our data checklist?
Now we need to dive into the data that tells us how the actual fracturing will behave down there.
Okay, so we're getting to the heart of the matter now, the fracturing itself.
Exactly. We need to consider things like fracture height, how much fluid we're going to lose during the process, and how the tip of the fracture will act.
Okay, lots to unpack there. Let's break it down. What specific data points do we need for each of those categories?
Well, for starters, any prior knowledge about the in situ stress is incredibly valuable.
In situ stress, that's the pressure the rock is already under, right?
Exactly. This helps us predict how those fractures will behave.
What if we're working in a brand new formation where we don't have any prior data? How do we get that information?
We might be able to extrapolate from nearby wells or use some general knowledge about the stress regime in that area.
So we're making some educated guesses based on what we know about similar formations.
Exactly. It's like trying to navigate a new city. You might not have all the details, but you can make some inferences based on what you know about similar cities.
Right. You look for patterns and try to connect the dots. Okay, what about modulus data? What's that all about?
Modulus basically tells us how stiff the rock is.
Okay, stiffness. How does that matter for hydraulic fracturing?
It affects how wide our fractures are going to be. We can get this data from sonic logs, but we have to make sure we're using the right type of sonic log and that we're correcting the data to account for those real-world conditions down in the reservoir.
Why are these corrections so important?
Well, imagine you're building a bridge. You need to know the real strength of the materials, right?
Yeah, you don't want the bridge to collapse.
Exactly. The same goes for fracturing. We need to know the true strength of the rock, its static modulus,
Mm-hmm.
to design a treatment that's not going to cause problems.
Mm.
The sonic logs give us the dynamic modulus, which is a good starting point, but we need to adjust it based on things like temperature and the stresses caused by tectonic plates.
So we're fine-tuning our understanding based on those real-world conditions.
Exactly. And that's why data analysis and interpretation are so important.
Makes sense. What other fracturing data do we need to be mindful of?
We need to know all about the fracturing fluid itself.
The fleet.
Yeah, how it's going to behave down in the reservoir. Things like its viscosity, how much we're likely to lose during the process, and how well it will build up that filter cake on the fracture walls.
Filter cake, what's that?
It's a thin layer of solids that builds up on the fracture walls and helps keep them open.
Oh, okay, so the fluid is more than just a liquid. It's got these special properties that help create and maintain those fractures.
Exactly. It's a critical component of the entire operation.
Okay, I'm starting to see the complexity here. We've got the reservoir, the geological data, the fracturing data. It's a lot to keep track of. What about pre-frac tests? What role do they play in all of this?
Pre-frac tests are like these little mini experiments we run before the main event.
Mini experiments.
Yeah, they give us a sneak peek at how the formation's going to behave and help us tweak our design.
So it's like a dress rehearsal before the big show. What kind of tests are we talking about?
Well, there are a few different types. We might do a step rate test to figure out the pressure required to open up the fractures.
Oh, to get these fractures going.
Exactly. Or we might do a mini frac to see how much fluid we're going to lose. These tests give us critical data points that we can plug into our models and refine our predictions.
It's fascinating how much testing and analysis goes into this. We're really trying to eliminate as many unknowns as possible.
That's the goal. The more we understand the subsurface, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions.
Okay, we've covered the reservoir data, the geological data, and the fracturing data. What's next on our data checklist?
Now we need to talk about the well itself.
Well, data, got it. What are the key things we need to know about the well?
Well, we need to know the path of the wellbore, especially if it's deviated or horizontal. That can affect how well those fractures communicate with the wellbore.
So we're talking about the shape of the well, how it's drilled.
Exactly. We also need to know about the perforations.
Perforations.
Those are the holes we create in the well casing to allow the fracturing fluid to enter the formation.
Oh, okay, kind of like entry points for the fluid to flow out into the rock.
Exactly. The size, spacing, and even the angle of those perforations can affect how well the treatment performs.
So we're talking about pretty small details that can have a big impact. It sounds like we're creating a blueprint for the wellbore and the surrounding formation, making sure everything is lined up correctly.
Yeah, it's all about understanding how that wellbore is going to interact with the reservoir.
Okay, so we've got the wellbore path and the perforations. What other well-specific data do we need?
We need to know the configuration of the wellbore for both the treatment and production phases.
Treatment and production.
Yeah. This includes things like the diameter of the tubing and the casing, the pressure limits of the equipment, and how the well is set up to handle both the injecting of the fracturing fluid and the producing of hydrocarbons.
So we need to think about how the well is built and how it's going to function under stress. Kind of like an architect designing a building to withstand earthquakes, right?
Precisely. We also need to consider the planned production conditions, like the pressure we'll be producing at, the rates we're expecting, and the equipment we'll be using.
Ah, so we're thinking ahead, planning for how we're going to get those hydrocarbons out. And that information is important for economic analysis, right?
Absolutely. We need to know if this whole operation is going to be profitable.
Right. We need to make sure it makes sense from a business perspective. So what kind of economic data do we need to gather?
Well, to do a proper economic analysis, we need to look at both price and cost data.
Okay, price and cost makes sense. What are some examples of cost data that we should be considering?
Well, things like the cost of the fracturing fluid itself, the proppant, the horsepower needed for pumping, the basic drilling and completion costs, all of those factors.
Right, so it's not just about how much oil or gas we can get out, it's about making sure we can do it at a price that makes sense. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already.
Yeah.
Reservoir data, well, data, geological data, economic data, it's a lot to digest. What's the final piece of the data puzzle?
The last piece of the puzzle is data about the fracturing fluid and the proppant, those little sand grains that hold the fractures open.
Okay, let's dive into that. What kind of data do we need for the fracturing fluid?
The most important thing is the fluid's rheology.
Rheology.
It's a fancy word for how the fluid flows. We need to know how viscous it is, how it will behave under different pressures and temperatures, and how it's going to interact with the rock formation.
So we're not just pumping any old liquid down there. We need to choose a fluid that's carefully engineered for the specific job.
Exactly. It's got to be compatible with the formation fluids, the rock itself, and any other chemicals we're using.
What could go wrong if we don't choose the right fluid?
Well, for example, if the fluid isn't compatible with the formation fluids, we could create emulsions.
Emulsions.
Yeah, kind of like when you mix oil and water. Those emulsions can block the flow of hydrocarbons and really mess things up.
So it's like creating a traffic jam in our hydrocarbon highway. Not good.
Not good at all.
Okay, so fluid rheology is critical. What about the proppant data? What are the key things we need to know there?
The two big things are conductivity and availability. Conductivity refers to how well that proppant maintains permeability.
So how well it keeps those fractures open over time.
Exactly. It needs to withstand the heat, the pressure, all the forces down there, and not break down or get clogged up.
Okay, so we're looking for a proppant that's tough and reliable. What about availability?
We need to make sure we can actually get the type of proppant we need in the quantities we need and at a price that makes sense.
So it's like making sure you have all the ingredients before you start baking a cake. You don't want to run out of flour halfway through.
Exactly. We need to make sure we have everything we need before we start pumping.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see the big picture here.
Yeah.
To design and execute a successful hydraulic fracturing treatment, we need a massive amount of data, from the reservoir to the wellbore to the fluids and the proppants and everything in between.
That's right. Hydraulic fracturing is a complex process, but with the right data, we can make informed decisions, optimize those treatments, and minimize the risks.
It's all about making data-driven decisions.
Exactly. Data is the foundation for everything we do. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. All this data we've been talking about, it's like it paints this picture of what's happening thousands of feet below the surface.
It really is like putting together this giant three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, right? But with so many pieces, so many data points, how do you even know where to start? Like, how do you prioritize what's most important?
That's a great question. It's easy to get bogged down in all the technical details,
Hmm.
but I think ultimately it all boils down to the objectives of the project. What are we actually trying to achieve here?
Okay, so it's not just a one-size-fits-all approach. The data you focus on depends on what you're trying to accomplish.
Exactly. Let's say our goal is to maximize production from a tight gas reservoir. In that case, we'd really hone in on the data related to permeability, those natural fractures we talked about, and proppant conductivity. We need to make sure those hydrocarbons can flow freely.
Okay, so in that scenario, production is king. But what if we're working in a more environmentally sensitive area? Does that shift our focus?
Absolutely. If we're dealing with a sensitive environment, we might prioritize data related to fluid compatibility, stress orientation, and making sure we avoid those nearby water zones. We want to minimize any potential negative impacts.
Right, so it's all about finding that balance. We want to get the most out of our resources, but we got to do it in a way that protects the environment and the communities we're working in.
It's a challenge, for sure,
Hmm.
but it's a challenge we have to face head on.
I agree. We can't just ignore the risks. So we've talked about the different types of data and how we prioritize them, but how do we actually collect this data in the first place? What are some of the tools and techniques you use?
Well, we've already touched on a few, like logging and core analysis and those pre-frac tests, but there's also a technique called seismic surveying that can give us a lot of information on a larger scale.
Seismic surveys, yeah, I've heard of those. They use sound waves to create images of the subsurface, right? But how do they help us with hydraulic fracturing design specifically?
It's like, imagine an ultrasound for the Earth. Seismic surveys use sound waves to create those images of the subsurface, and they help us identify faults, folds, any kind of features that might impact how those fractures are going to grow.
So it's like having X-ray vision for the Earth. We can see beneath the surface.
That's a great way to put it. It helps us map out that underground landscape and avoid any surprises.
That makes a lot of sense. It's incredible how technology allows us to see things that were once hidden. Okay, so we've gathered all this data from all these different sources. Now what? How do we make sense of it all?
That's where the real magic happens. It's data analysis time. We're talking about finding patterns, identifying trends, and making connections.
So it's like you're piecing together a puzzle, looking for clues to solve a mystery.
Exactly. We use sophisticated software and modeling techniques to take all that data and create simulations of how the reservoir is going to respond to the treatment.
Oh, wow. So you're running these virtual experiments almost.
Exactly. We can tweak different parameters in the model,
Yeah.
try different scenarios, and see how it all plays out.
That sounds incredibly powerful, like you're really trying to understand the story that the data is telling you.
You got it. And that helps us make more informed decisions.
Okay, I can see how data analysis is a crucial part of this process, but I imagine it can get pretty complex, especially with all the data we're dealing with.
It definitely can be. But that's where experience and expertise come in.
Right, it's not just about plugging numbers into a computer, it's about understanding what those numbers mean, how they relate to each other, and how to use them to make the best decisions. It's like you need a skilled chef to take those raw ingredients and create a delicious meal, right?
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
We need to combine data analysis with our knowledge of the subsurface to really optimize these treatments.
Okay, I'm starting to see how data is really at the heart of everything you do. But with all this data being collected, are there any challenges that come with managing it and interpreting it? Like, is there anything that keeps you up at night when it comes to all this data?
Definitely. Data management is a huge part of what we do. We got to make sure the data is accurate, reliable, and that everyone who needs it can access it.
Right, so it's not just about collecting data, it's about organizing it, storing it securely, and making sure everyone's working from the same playbook. Like a well-oiled machine, everyone needs to be in sync.
Exactly. We use some pretty sophisticated data management systems to keep track of everything. It's like a giant library.
Yeah.
But instead of books, we've got terabytes of data.
Wow, that's a lot to keep organized. And with so many different people involved in a hydraulic fracturing project, geologists, engineers, environmental scientists, how do you make sure everyone's on the same page? Because they all need access to different pieces of this puzzle, right?
Yeah, that's where data visualization comes in. We use maps, charts, graphs, all those visuals to help us communicate those complex ideas in a way that's easy to understand.
It's like translating a technical document into a language that everyone can grasp. A picture's worth 1,000 words, right?
Exactly. And data visualization helps us see the big picture, identify trends, and make better decisions. It's crucial for communication and collaboration.
So we've got this huge amount of data. We're managing it. We're visualizing it. We're sharing it. It's clear that data is the backbone of everything you do. But I'm curious, what are some of the emerging trends and challenges in this field? Like, where do you see the future of data in hydraulic fracturing heading?
That's a great question. One of the most exciting trends is the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence, AI, in data analysis.
Oh, AI. That's interesting. I've been hearing a lot about that lately. How is it being used in the oil and gas industry?
Well, machine learning algorithms can process huge amounts of data much faster and more efficiently than we ever could. They can identify those patterns, those trends that we might miss, and help us build better predictive models.
So instead of manually digging through spreadsheets and reports, we can let the computers do the heavy lifting.
Exactly. That frees up our time to focus on more strategic tasks.
It's like having a superpowered assistant, right? But are there any potential downsides to this reliance on AI? What about the human element, the expertise that you bring to the table?
There are definitely challenges we need to be mindful of. One of the biggest is making sure that the data we feed these algorithms is accurate and unbiased. Otherwise, we could end up with biased algorithms, and that could lead to some pretty bad decisions.
Right, garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. We also have to remember that AI is a tool. It's not a replacement for human judgment and expertise. We still need to interpret those results and make the final call. It's about using AI to enhance our capabilities,
Mhm.
not to replace us entirely.
So it's a partnership between humans and machines.
Exactly. We need to find that balance.
Okay, so AI is a big trend. Any other challenges you're facing?
Another big one is data security.
Hmm.
As we become more reliant on data, we also become more vulnerable to cyber attacks. And that's a huge concern in our industry. We're talking about sensitive information that, if it falls into the wrong hands, could have some pretty serious consequences.
Yeah, cybersecurity is a big deal. It seems like every industry is dealing with that these days.
It's an ongoing battle. We have to stay ahead of the curve, invest in robust security measures, and make sure everyone's aware of the risks.
Okay, so AI and data security. What other trends are shaping the future of data in hydraulic fracturing?
One of the biggest trends, and maybe one of the biggest challenges too, is the need for more transparency and collaboration. The public wants to understand the risks and benefits of hydraulic fracturing, and they want to know that it's being done responsibly.
So it's not just about collecting data, it's about sharing that information with the public and having open and honest conversations about what you're doing. It's about building trust.
Exactly. We need to show people that we're not trying to hide anything. We're using data to make better decisions, minimize risks, and protect the environment.
And that data can be a powerful tool for communicating those efforts, right?
Absolutely. If we're transparent about our operations and willing to share data, it shows that we're serious about doing things the right way. It's about being accountable to the public.
It sounds like you're advocating for a more open and collaborative approach to data. That's really refreshing to hear, because sometimes it feels like there's a wall between the industry and the public, and data can help break down those walls.
I agree. We need to break down those walls and build bridges instead. We're all in this together, and we need to work together to find solutions. Data can be a powerful tool for building those bridges.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. It's fascinating to see how data is driving so much innovation and change in the oil and gas industry.
It's definitely an exciting time to be in this field. We're at the forefront of a data revolution, and it's changing everything we do.
Well, speaking of change, where do you see the industry heading in the next 5 or 10 years? What role will data play in shaping that future?
Well, I think one thing is for sure, the volume of data we're collecting is only going to grow exponentially.
So we're talking about a tsunami of data coming our way.
Exactly. And we need to be prepared to handle that influx of information. That means investing in better data management systems, more powerful analytical tools, and developing new approaches to visualization and communication.
It sounds like the industry is going to need a whole new set of skills and expertise to navigate this data-driven future.
Absolutely. We need people who are not just comfortable with data, but who can actually think critically about it, who can ask the right questions, and who can translate those insights into meaningful actions.
So it's not just about being data literate, it's about being data fluent.
Exactly. We need data storytellers, people who can take all that raw information and weave it into a compelling narrative that everyone can understand.
That's a great way to put it, data storytelling. Because at the end of the day, it's all about communication.
Right. Absolutely. We need to communicate the science, the challenges, and the opportunities to a wider audience. And data can be a powerful tool for doing that.
Well, I think you've done a fantastic job of doing that today. You've taken a complex topic and made it accessible and engaging.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
So to our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the world of hydraulic fracturing design data. It's a rapidly evolving field, and there's so much more to explore.
And we encourage you to keep digging, keep asking questions, and keep learning. Because the more we understand about the science and the data behind hydraulic fracturing, the better equipped we'll be to make informed decisions about our energy future.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into hydraulic fracturing design data. From the nitty-gritty details of rock properties to the big picture view of the entire industry, it's amazing how much data is involved in every step of the process.
It really is. And I think this last part of our deep dive is where we can connect all those dots. We've talked about the types of data, how it's collected and analyzed and managed. But now let's zoom out and think about the bigger picture. Like, what does all this information tell us about the future of the industry?
Yeah, that's a great point. We've seen how data drives every decision in hydraulic fracturing, but what are the big picture trends and challenges that this data is revealing? Well, one of the most prominent trends is the increasing emphasis on sustainability and environmental responsibility. As we learn more about the potential impacts of hydraulic fracturing, there's a growing demand for data that can help us minimize those impacts.
So it's not just about getting as much oil and gas out of the ground as possible anymore. It's about doing it in a way that protects the environment and the communities where these operations are taking place.
Exactly. We're seeing a real shift toward using data to monitor and mitigate environmental risks, like groundwater contamination or induced seismicity.
Induced seismicity, that's when human activities trigger earthquakes, right? That sounds pretty serious.
It is a concern, but thankfully it's relatively rare. And data from seismic monitoring networks and well operations can help us understand those mechanisms behind induced seismicity and develop strategies to minimize the risk.
So it's like we're using data to listen to the earth, to understand how our actions are affecting it and adjust our approach accordingly.
Precisely. And as we gather more data, we're getting better at predicting and preventing those unintended consequences. Data is becoming essential for, responsible environmental stewardship.
That's really encouraging to hear. What other trends are you seeing in terms of data usage in the industry?
Another trend is using data analytics to optimize production and reduce costs.
Oh, so squeezing every drop we can out of those reservoirs.
In a way, yes, but we're also doing it smarter and more efficiently. We're using data to pinpoint the sweet spots in the reservoir, fine-tune our fracturing designs, and get the most out of every well.
So less waste, more efficiency.
Exactly. Data analytics can help us reduce the number of wells we drill, minimize water usage, optimize proppant placement, all of which leads to lower costs and a smaller environmental footprint.
So it's a win-win situation, using data to improve both the economic and environmental bottom line. It sounds like data is really the key to unlocking a more efficient and sustainable future for the oil and gas industry.
I think it is. And as that volume of data keeps growing, the possibilities for innovation are, well, pretty much endless. But of course, with all this data, we also have some challenges.
Yeah, that makes sense. What are some of the hurdles you're facing in managing this ever-expanding sea of data?
One of the biggest is data integration. We're collecting data from so many different sources. Well, logs, seismic surveys, production data, environmental monitoring systems, and it's not always easy to put it all together in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's like having all the pieces of a super complex puzzle, but not knowing how they fit together.
Exactly. It's a constant effort to make sure all that data is talking to each other. We need better tools and techniques for data integration, so we can get that holistic view of what's going on down there and make the best decisions.
So data integration is a big one. What other issues are keeping you up at night?
Data security is another one. The more we depend on data, the more vulnerable we become to cyber attacks. And it's a serious threat, something we really can't afford to ignore.
Yeah, cybersecurity is a hot topic these days. It seems like everyone's worried about it.
And for good reason. It's a constant race to stay ahead of the bad guys and protect our data and systems.
It sounds like you're taking it seriously, which is good to hear. So we've talked about data integration, data security. Anything else that's top of mind for you?
Well, I think, maybe the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity is this need for greater transparency and collaboration. We're gathering all this data about hydraulic fracturing, and I think we need to be more open about sharing it.
So you're talking about sharing data with the public. That seems a little counterintuitive, for a company to want to share its data, especially when some of it might be sensitive.
I get that. I do. But I think transparency is the only way to build trust. By being open about what we're doing, how we're using data to make better decisions, I think that's how we can start to have a constructive dialogue about hydraulic fracturing.
So it's about moving away from this like us versus them mentality and acknowledging that everyone has a stake in this.
Exactly. We're all in this together. And the more we understand each other's perspectives, the better we can work together to find solutions that benefit everyone.
It sounds like you're really advocating for a more open and collaborative approach, which is, I think, really important.
It's the only way forward, in my opinion. We can't operate in a silo anymore. We need to engage with all stakeholders, share information, and work together.
This has been such a fascinating conversation. It's really clear that data is like this driving force behind innovation and progress in the oil and gas industry.
It's an exciting time to be in this field, that's for sure.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to share your expertise with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
And to our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the world of hydraulic fracturing design data. As you can see, it's a complex, constantly evolving field.
But it's a field where data is playing an increasingly important role.
Absolutely. So keep learning, keep asking questions, and stay curious, because the future of energy depends on it. Until next time, thanks for listening.